everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Assessing Vendor Risk, a Deeper Dive webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Questions, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will answer some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials, answer all 3 polling questions that appear on your screen during the presentation, be in attendance for the entire live 1-hour session, and complete the follow-up survey. That follow-up survey link will be sent to you 24 hours after the live session concludes. If you meet all requirements, we will send your CPE certificate within 7 to 10 business days following survey submission. With us today, we have Christine Kitamira, Van Minder's Senior Content Manager of Education. She will discuss the process of completing a vendor risk assessment from start to finish. By the end of the session, you'll better understand how to conduct a vendor risk assessment and its importance in managing third-party risk. You will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our 6 steps of an inherent risk assessment on vendors infographic and sample questionnaire, our 6 vendor risk categories and common red flags infographic, separating vendor criticality from risk ratings infographic, as well as a link to a library of additional resources, all in the related content widget. With all that being said, I would like to hand it over to Christine. Christine, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on today's webinar. As many of us know, assessing vendor risk is one of the most fundamental elements of third-party risk management. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to do a deeper dive on this topic and talk about the main points you see here on the agenda. I'll start off with some of the basics like common categories and types of vendor risk, along with some real-world examples. I'm also going to give a brief overview of vendor criticality and walk through the steps of how to perform a vendor risk assessment, which includes determining residual risk. And finally, I'll explain 4 different risk handling techniques, but I'll focus on mitigation and give some examples of how you might mitigate each type of inherent risk with some due diligence recommendations. And you'll also learn about some next steps to take after you complete the vendor risk assessment. Here's a look at the main categories of inherent risk that I'll be covering today in more detail. The first 7 are pretty standard and often mentioned in different regulatory guidance, but I'm also going to review these additional risks that might not be as well known. And off to the right, you'll see just a brief description of third-party risk, which is essentially the risk posed to an organization by its vendors, suppliers, service providers, etc. On these next 2 slides, you'll see each inherent risk listed out with some example yes/no questions that can be used to determine whether that risk type is present in the relationship. And using yes/no questions helps avoid any ambiguity and makes it easier to calculate that inherent risk rating. And one thing I want to mention that will become more apparent as we go through each risk type is that there's often a lot of overlap between 2 or more inherent risks. For example, that first question for operational risk asks, is sensitive data being accessed by the vendor? If you answer yes, that could present operational risk, but also regulatory risk, information security risk, and even reputation risk. Here are some more example questions, and I want to point out that some of these might need to be adapted to use in your own third-party risk management program. Looking at financial and credit risk, that first question is asking, will this product or service require an expense of over $50,000 within a single year? That amount is something that your organization would need to determine for itself. And even that second question asks about a significant revenue stream. So again, this is something that would need to be defined by your organization. So just keep in mind that these example questions can be used as helpful guidelines, but it's still important to adapt them as needed and use additional questions that are relevant for your organization and vendor relationships. Starting off with strategic risk, here are several examples that you might see in your vendor relationships. Think about a vendor that launches a new product which fails or becomes obsolete because of a competitor. A vendor that uses aging technology or makes sudden changes to its core products or services could also create strategic risk. And even a regulatory change could affect the profitability of the vendor's product or service if there are new compliance requirements that need to be followed. The real-world example is one that most of you are probably familiar with when Blockbuster became obsolete after Netflix launched its streaming service. Of course, Netflix became highly successful and Blockbuster just couldn't compete anymore and closed nearly all of its retail stores. Moving on to operational risk, this can be divided into two main categories. The first category would be one where your operations are negatively impacted because of the vendor's internal factors, such as processes, people, controls, or systems that are ineffective or have failed. So if you think about a vendor that hires inexperienced employees, this could create delays or some other operational disruptions for your organization. The second category of operational risk refers to external events like natural disasters or outages, some of which aren't fully avoidable. But it's still important to identify these risks so you can determine whether the vendor is prepared to respond and recover from these events. An example shown here is a telecommunications company that suffered an outage because a third-party provider cut fiber during the installation process. The next inherent risk is business continuity risk, which can occur when an external event prevents the vendor from conducting business as usual, which then impacts your organization or customers. Some examples shown here would be a vendor that isn't prepared for technology outages and failures, or a vendor that hasn't tested its business continuity and disaster recovery plans. Even if a vendor has these plans in place, that doesn't say anything about whether those plans are effective. It's kind of like having a fire alarm installed, but not actually testing it to make sure it works. And the real-world example of this risk type is the infamous ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline back in 2021, which ended up shutting down their operations for 5 days. Regulatory and compliance risk is another common risk type you can identify in third-party relationships, and this can generally fall into two categories. The first would be the risk of a third party causing non-compliance issues with any laws or regulations that govern your organization. Regardless of the industry you're in, there's going to be various laws and regulations that you need to comply with, such as labor laws, privacy laws, and even marketing and advertising regulations. So let's say your third party is handling your direct marketing services. That would be a regulatory risk that you'd want to identify and manage. If your vendor is violating certain regulations, like engaging in deceptive marketing, that could be a situation that impacts your organization and creates legal and regulatory fines that you're responsible for paying. Here are a few more examples of regulatory and compliance risk, which could include a third party that isn't complying with laws or regulations, either intentionally or unintentionally because of ignorance. Remember that certain laws and regulations can vary by industry, so it's always your responsibility to ensure that your vendors are compliant with the regulations that you're required to follow. And the second category of compliance risk I want to mention would be a third party that simply isn't following your organization's internal policies and procedures. So of course, following laws and regulations are important, but don't forget about any internal compliance that your vendor has to follow. And the real-world example here is a medical debt collector that was issued a $95,000 fine for violating the FTC's Fair Credit Reporting Act. Moving on to the next risk, we have information security risk, and this includes cyber and physical. And even though we live in a world where so much data is digital, it's important to remember that there's always going to be physical data as well, which also needs to be protected both while it's being stored and even during destruction. Most of these examples are probably familiar, such as data breaches, phishing, and malware attacks. Information security risk is usually one of the most well-known types of third-party risks because these are the incidents that usually make headlines on a regular basis. If you do a quick Google search of vendor data breaches, I'm sure you can find several recent stories about maybe a healthcare or financial services organization that announced it suffered a third-party breach. And just to emphasize the point I made before about overlapping risks, this could be an example of information security and reputation risk overlapping with each other. When an organization announces a vendor data breach, sometimes they mention the vendor by name, but the public is usually going to remember the name of the main company, not the vendor who was at fault of the breach. Financial and credit risk is another one that can be divided into two main categories. The first refers to the vendor's poor financial health. This could occur because of many different factors, such as the vendor losing a major customer, maybe they're facing litigation expenses or regulatory fines, or they have a lot of payments to other customers because of unmet SLAs. A vendor's poor financial health can often lead to what's known as a domino effect, where they're unable to meet your organization's needs. Maybe they have to lay off a significant percentage of its employees, which then leads to decreased productivity, which then negatively impacts your organization. Another example would be a vendor that is no longer able to afford investing in their cybersecurity program. Maybe they have the minimum security controls in place, but those just aren't as effective to protect against some of the more sophisticated threats that exist. So that would be a situation where financial risk is ultimately connected to cybersecurity risk. Financial and credit risk can also refer to a significant investment from your organization to either implement the product or service, manage the vendor's risk, or switch to an alternate vendor. And as I mentioned before, that investment or cost would be something your organization has to determine for itself. And a real-world example would be a vendor that loses one of its major customers. In a worst-case scenario, this could result in the vendor filing for bankruptcy and no longer being able to service your organization. If this is a critical vendor, that would probably create some significant issues as you look for a replacement. The next common risk type is reputation risk, which could occur if the vendor is delivering poor quality products or services on your behalf, such as a call center that has really poor customer service. I'm sure many of us have experienced calling a customer service number and dealing with long wait times or just really poor service. And in the end, we're usually not upset with the call center, we're upset with the main company that we're trying to contact. A vendor that has negative news could also create reputation risk, as well as one that suffers a data breach that impacts your customers. Another real-world example would be many fast fashion retailers that offer low-cost merchandise. Oftentimes, the reason behind those low costs is because of unethical working conditions, which can then create reputational damage once that's exposed to the public. Now I want to focus on some additional types of inherent risk, which might not be as well known as the others. Starting with concentration risk, the first example is single point of failure, which means that you have just one vendor who's supporting multiple high-risk or critical activities. As you can imagine, if that one vendor suffered an outage or failure, that means that each of those high-risk or critical activities would be impacted. Geographic concentration refers to multiple high-risk or critical vendors in the same geographic region. So something like a severe weather event could potentially impact all of these different vendors at the same time. Fourth-party concentration means that your vendors are outsourcing their products and services to the same subcontractors. So even though you might have a diverse group of vendors, each of them might be relying on one or just a few critical or high-risk vendors. And for the real-world example, many of the supply chain issues that occurred during COVID-19 could be linked to concentration risk because many organizations were dependent on a small quantity of suppliers. The next inherent risk type is geopolitical risk, which is the risk of loss caused by your vendor being in a country or region that's vulnerable to things like corruption, human rights violations, or political unrest. So some of the well-known events going on today are the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Palestine. Any vendors located in these regions could potentially be impacted by these conflicts and struggle to maintain normal business operations. Internet restrictions and expropriation would be other examples of geopolitical risk to be aware of. And in many of these cases, geopolitical risk is closely tied to business continuity risk, which is why it's so important to have plans in place that consider these types of vendors, especially if they're critical. And not only have business continuity plans in place, but make sure to test them to confirm they're effective. And for the real-world example, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act of 2021 impacted many manufacturers who were sourcing materials from the Xinjiang region. ESG risk is one that's been getting more attention in recent years as lawmakers are focusing on things like climate change and extreme weather events, human trafficking, and poor labor practices. Even cyber attacks and data breaches could potentially have an impact on environmental, social, and governance issues. For example, a cyber attack on critical infrastructure could potentially lead to an environmental incident, like spillage into a water system or pollution flowing into the ocean. And a real-world example of ESG risk is a medical waste company that was fined $1 million for environmental violations. And the final risk I want to talk about today is transactional risk, which can fall into these four categories of foreign exchange, interest rate, time, and counterparty. Anytime a vendor is processing payments or accepting payments on your behalf can expose you to transactional risk. One of the most easy to understand examples of transactional risk would be a third-party payment processor that fails to process payments on time. If your vendor is processing payments late for your customers, that could result in late fees and probably some significant reputational damage and even regulatory fines for your organization. Transactional risk is usually one that's rated high because of its impact on other risk areas like reputation, compliance, and operational. And the final risk I want to talk about today is transactional risk, which can fall into these four categories of foreign exchange, interest rate, time, and counterparty. Anytime a vendor is processing payments or accepting payments on your behalf can expose you to transactional risk. So one of the most easy to understand examples of transactional risk would be a third-party payment processor that fails to process payments on time. If your vendor is processing payments late for your customers, that could result in late fees and probably some significant reputational damage and even regulatory fines for your organization. Transactional risk is usually one that's rated high because of its impact on other risk areas like reputation, compliance, and operational. So the first step is to determine the vendor's criticality or business impact the vendor has on your internal operations. This should be a simple critical or non-critical determination and not a scale of low, moderate, or high as you would do with inherent risk. It's important to keep criticality and inherent risk separate because you really should understand which vendors are most critical or essential to your operations. This is something that regulators expect you to be able to identify. The three example questions can be used to help determine criticality, and answering yes to one or more will usually mean that the vendor should be considered critical. The next step is going to be identifying and measuring the inherent risk. This step essentially determines almost all of the other risk management activities you'll be performing, so it's important not to rush through this process and make sure you're being thorough in identifying and quantifying each risk type. The vendor's inherent risk has a really important purpose of telling you the amount of risk that exists naturally in the vendor's product or service. It's also used to determine the scope and amount of due diligence you'll need to perform. And it also helps establish the frequency of other activities like ongoing monitoring, risk reassessments, and periodic due diligence. Your critical and high-risk vendors are going to need the most oversight, which means that all of those activities will need to be performed more frequently. And a few other notes about inherent risk. As I mentioned a few times already, many risks can overlap with each other, but it's still important to assess them independently. Financial risk can overlap with cybersecurity risk, but these two risk types might still need different controls in place to manage them effectively. For example, a cybersecurity control like multi-factor authentication or penetration testing isn't going to have any impact on a vendor's financial risk. And assessments will require different subject matter experts that are qualified and usually certified in certain risk domains. A financial expert might be a CPA, and a cybersecurity expert might have some sort of certification in that area. So when it comes to actually measuring and quantifying inherent risk, it really just comes down to choosing the best methodology for your organization. You should also consider additional factors like your risk appetite and available resources and applications. The three main methodologies that are commonly used are subjective evaluation, a point system, or weighted questions. A point system or weighted questions might produce more consistent results, but overall, it's important to choose a methodology that you know will be effective for your own program. And as far as applications, many organizations work with manual tools like Excel or SharePoint, but of course there's other software that offers third-party risk management capabilities or even designated software for third-party risk management. And before we move on to the other steps in the risk assessment process, it's time for our first poll question of today's session.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, what is your biggest challenge when quantifying inherent risk? We have too many vendors to assess and not enough resources. We use a manual application that lacks certain features. Our process isn't consistent because we use different methodologies. Other or not sure. Christine, it looks like right now we have some time to answer a question from the audience. And this question is business continuity risk the same as criticality?
Well, there's definitely a lot of overlap between business continuity risk and criticality, but I would still recommend that these two things be assessed separately. So when you're assessing business continuity risk, you're going to be looking at a lot of evidence provided by the vendor, such as whether they've identified alternate locations and whether their plans and procedures have been recently tested. You might also be looking at the vendor's recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives, which may or may not meet your organization's needs. And all of these different elements will generally give you a risk rating of low, moderate, or high. And criticality, on the other hand, is a classification where you're identifying the vendor as critical or non-critical to your operations. So a critical vendor is usually one that would significantly disrupt your organization or customers if you were to suddenly lose their product or service, or if the service required longer than 24 hours to restore. But overall, if a vendor has high business continuity risk, there's a good chance that it will also be considered critical to your operations. So I hope that helps.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are the results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, as a reminder, in the related content widget, you will find our 6 steps of an inherent risk assessment on vendors infographic and sample questionnaire. As we've discussed the inherent risk of vendors, be sure to grab this resource. With that, I will hand it back to Christine.
Okay, let's continue with the next step of deciding how to handle the risk. There are 4 main risk handling techniques, which are avoidance, mitigation, transference, and acceptance. Avoiding the risk simply means you aren't going to continue with the vendor engagement, while mitigating the risk means implementing controls. Transferring the risk typically involves either insurance policies or contract indemnification, and acceptance means that you're accepting the risk as is with approval from your organization's leaders and stakeholders. But for today, we'll be focusing on mitigation, which is usually the technique used in third-party risk management. So mitigating risk is most effective when you're sharing the responsibility with your vendor. That means that there are internal and external factors you need to consider to ensure that the risk is mitigated properly. Some examples of internal factors would be reviewing the contract, ensuring approvals, and making sure information security controls like access management and encryption are considered in your system and your vendor system. And looking externally, you'll want to validate your vendor's controls by performing due diligence and establishing expectations for processes and procedures. Your vendor's training and background checks might also be factors to consider. At the top of the slide is a simple explanation of mitigation, which is reducing the occurrence, likelihood, or impact of risk through the application of controls. And notice that mitigation does not involve removing the risk altogether, but just reducing it to an acceptable level. Some of your vendor's controls might be dual authentication, biometric screening, and annual compliance training and testing. And even though these are your vendor's controls, your organization should collect evidence from the vendor that proves these controls are in place. Just because your vendor states that they're doing annual compliance training and testing doesn't necessarily mean that's true. Here are some examples of your organization's controls to mitigate vendor risk. Developing and testing a business continuity and disaster recovery plan that includes your critical vendors would be an important control to have in place. Other common controls might be following the principle of least privilege and not giving your vendor more access than what is necessary for them to perform their function. Tracking vendor issues through remediation is another important control because it's very common for issues to go unresolved simply because there's no process in place to make sure they're being monitored and followed up on. If you think about a simple vendor issue like a due diligence document that isn't collected, there's a good chance that that would just be forgotten unless you're actively tracking that situation until it's resolved. And identifying and testing an exit strategy for critical and high-risk vendors is another important control that your organization should have. Before I get into this next section of mitigating the inherent risks, I just want to explain these two symbols that appear on some of the slides. The first is an inherent risk that also has a business impact, which means that it should also be considered in your business impact analysis, if that's something that your organization does, and it should also be considered in your criticality assessment or determination. The symbol basically indicates that the vendor is likely critical to your operations. The next is an inherent risk that may automatically rate the vendor as high risk, either because of the vendor's access to sensitive information or the vendor interacting directly with your customers. So even though the other risks might be rated as low or moderate, the overall risk rating would be high because of this one risk. For each of these inherent risk types, you'll see a risk example and some due diligence recommendations that can help mitigate the risk. Starting off with strategic risk, the example is a vendor's product or service that doesn't align with your strategic goals. Some due diligence recommendations might be making sure the vendor is approved by the appropriate leadership or committee and making sure that any insurance and SLAs are in place. And that last bullet is actually baseline due diligence for any type of vendor because you'll want to make sure that you're doing business with a legitimate company that has a good reputation. Here are some examples of operational risk, such as the vendor having access to sensitive information or hosting or storing non-public information. If you'll remember, that symbol means that these risks might prevail above all other risks and automatically rate the vendor as high risk. So due diligence for a vendor that has access to sensitive information would be all of these recommendations, like reviewing and validating the vendor's InfoSec practices and making sure security requirements are included in your contract. For a vendor that only has unescorted physical access to your facilities, but does not have access to any sensitive information, you would probably want to at least review the vendor's privacy policy and validate their employee vetting and training practices. so you'll know that the vendor's employees are properly trained to certain standards. For business continuity risk, the example here is a vendor that has a material impact on your organization or customers. So that symbol means you should consider this risk in your criticality determination because it's very likely that this is also a critical vendor. Due diligence recommendations would be validating the vendor's business continuity and disaster recovery controls, which include testing and results, and establishing an exit strategy, which may include identifying a replacement vendor even before you sign the contract. An exit strategy allows you to safely exit the relationship either when the contract term ends or early because of issues like poor performance or a data breach. You may also want to include quantifiable service level agreements to ensure that this vendor meets your service delivery expectations. For regulatory and compliance risk, I'll just focus on that first example of the vendor processing financial transactions on your behalf or having access to payment card industry data. Due diligence for this type of vendor would include reviewing InfoSec governance, privacy, and compliance controls, and also validating the vendor's PCI-DSS certification as applicable. Remember that non-compliance caused by your vendor can still result in financial loss from regulatory fines and legal fees for your organization, so it's essential to verify that your vendor is complying with any applicable laws and regulations. Information security risks can include a vendor's product that integrates with your network or the vendor's personnel that has access to your network. For these types of risks, there's a lot of important due diligence to review. First of all, you'll want to make sure that the product or service is reviewed and approved by appropriate stakeholders. And it's also important to validate the vendor's human resources and training practices. This gives you a better understanding of how the vendor is assessing the qualifications of its employees that are going to have access to your network. You would also want to review the vendor's InfoSec, privacy, and compliance controls. To mitigate financial and credit risk, it's important to assess the vendor's financial health. This generally means having an expert do a review of the vendor's financial statements to determine the overall financial health of the vendor and identify any red flags that may need further review. Other due diligence would be establishing an exit strategy and reviewing the vendor's business continuity and disaster recovery controls. If the vendor is supporting a significant revenue stream, you'll want to make sure that the vendor is capable of continuing operations during a business disrupting event. Now on to reputation risk. If the vendor has an impact on your customers or directly interacts with them, there are several due diligence recommendations to consider. Remember that this direct interaction essentially means that the vendor is representing your organization. So it's important to do things like assess the vendor's reputation and look for any negative news, legal concerns, or regulatory issues. You should also make sure that the vendor has compliance and performance monitoring practices, including issue management. You don't want to just assume that the vendor has a process in place to identify, track, and remediate issues. It's important to actually see evidence of this process. For concentration risk, some of the due diligence recommendations are reviewing the vendor's business continuity and disaster recovery controls, assessing the vendor's financial health, and establishing an exit strategy. Reviewing the vendor's vendor risk management practices is another important due diligence recommendation. Remember that each of your vendors has their own vendors that they're working with, so you'll want to make sure that they're managing their own third-party risk. Since your organization doesn't have a direct relationship with its fourth parties, it's important to make sure that your vendors are monitoring their own vendors and performing risk assessments, just like you're doing. The next inherent risk to mitigate is geopolitical risk, which might occur if the vendor's services are international and they have access to your network, or if your data is hosted overseas. Some of the due diligence will be similar to other vendors that are domestic, meaning that you would review SOC reports, cybersecurity policies, and background check policies. Other due diligence you may want to review are disclosures of any civil, criminal, and regulatory matters, and evidence that the vendor has knowledge and compliance with anti-corruption laws and other relevant regulations. You might also want to consider requesting policies or statements related to workers' rights and modern slavery, and any environmental and sustainability practices, including metrics and reporting. Some ESG risks you might identify could be a vendor that hasn't conducted a baseline assessment of its carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, or a vendor that hasn't mapped its supply chain for core products and services. And another potential ESG risk would be a vendor that doesn't have policies in place to address issues like labor standards and modern slavery. There's a lot of due diligence recommendations listed here, like reviewing any ESG-related standards or certifications that are available from these organizations, and reviewing a full list of countries where the vendor is conducting business. Also consider reviewing the vendor supplier code of ethics and any carbon disclosures and whistleblower protections that the vendor has in place. And the final type of inherent risk to mitigate is transactional risk. The two examples here are a vendor that processes customer transactions or a vendor that uses foreign currency. For due diligence, you'd want to validate the vendor's PCI-DSS compliance and verify that the vendor has fraud prevention controls in place. Financial health and stability is also important to assess, along with business continuity plans, OFAC checks, and compliance with cross-border transaction regulations. And anti-money laundering practices should also be assessed for transactional risk. And that brings us to our second poll question of today's webinar.
Our second poll question of the day is, which of the following best describes how your organization mitigates inherent risk? We start by confirming vendor controls are in place and then apply our own. We apply our own controls first and then review and validate the vendor's controls. We only review and validate the vendor's controls, other or not sure. Christina, I have another question here that we can answer.
Okay.
And this question is, should some risk be given more weight or importance in an assessment?
This is a really great question, and many organizations do choose to give more weight or importance to certain risks in their assessments. And of course, the weight is going to be different depending on a lot of factors, like the types of regulations that apply to your organization and the industry you're in, and even your organization's overall risk appetite. But what I've seen around this topic is that many organizations give more weight to risks that involve data security, because data breaches and other cyber events can have widespread impacts on other risk areas like operations, financial, reputations, etc. For example, let's say you have two separate vendors that have access to your sensitive data. One vendor is actually storing that data within their own system, and the other one isn't storing it but has limited access through your system. The risk of the vendor that's storing your data might be weighted more heavily than the other vendor that only has limited access to it. And if you choose to give your risks different weights on an assessment, it's important to support your reasoning with an explanation of why this particular risk is weighted more than others. That can give auditors and examiners an understanding of how your organization is assessing different types of risks.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our 6 vendor risk categories and common red flags infographic in the related content widget. This handy resource walks you through each of the main vendor risk categories and red flags associated with those risks. Christine, back to you.
Okay, now that we've decided how to handle the inherent risk through mitigation and collected the vendor's due diligence, it's time to move on to the next step of assessing all that vendor information. Due diligence should always be reviewed by qualified SMEs who can be internal or external to your organization. Most organizations don't have full-time SMEs in every risk domain, so it's very common to use external ones when needed. These SMEs provide opinions on both internal and external controls, stating whether they are in place and effective. They can also identify any issues or gaps and recommend how they should be remediated. For example, you might be doing due diligence on a new payment processor that hasn't tested its business continuity plan in over a year. The SME might recommend that you don't sign the vendor contract until that plan has been tested. After assessing that vendor information, we finish the risk assessment process by establishing internal controls and determining residual risk. Residual risk can be a little tricky to understand, so I hope this visual helps explain how inherent risk transforms into residual risk. You essentially begin with the inherent risk, looking at both the types and amounts. You then determine what the impact is of mitigating that risk by reviewing vendor information and applying controls. The term controls can refer to any sort of process or safeguard that is put in place to balance the inherent risk. So multi-factor authentication might be an example of a control your vendor has in place to protect your data within its system. What comes out as a result is the residual or leftover risk. Now, here are some things to know about residual risk, starting with its purpose. So many third-party risk management activities are based on inherent risk, but the residual risk still plays an important role. Residual risk shows the risk that remains in your vendor relationship after controls have been applied, and it also helps identify any miscalculations that may have occurred. Residual risk will never be higher than inherent risk. So if your calculation determines this, you know that you need to go back and revisit your process to see where you went wrong. Residual risk also helps determine whether it's been mitigated enough to an acceptable level, whatever that might be for your organization. And here are some helpful tips to use when calculating residual risk. First, you're going to complete due diligence, which means reviewing and validating all of that vendor information. Next, you'll apply both internal and external controls. So these are controls that your organization puts in place to manage the risk, as well as ensuring that the vendor has controls in place. And remember that residual risk is always equal to or lower than the inherent risk. Even if the residual risk is at an acceptable level, the frequency of risk assessments, monitoring, and managing your vendors will still be based on the inherent risk rating. So a vendor with a risk rating of high might be mitigated to moderate risk, but you're still treating it as a high-risk vendor. Here's another helpful visual that helps explain the concept of inherent risks being balanced by controls. A vendor that contains risks such as having access to PII, processing payments, requiring state licensing, and operating 24/7 would typically be rated as high risk. With no controls in place, that risk is unbalanced and just inherently high for the vendor engagement. However, once these controls have been put in place and verified, that scale is balanced and that previous high risk rating is lowered to moderate risk. Some of these controls would be validating that the vendor is fully licensed and PCI certified, and reviewing its SOC report to confirm it has satisfactory information security controls in place. All of those risks are still there in the vendor engagement, but the controls bring them to a more acceptable level, so your organization is more confident in working with that vendor. If those controls had no impact on the inherent risk, that would usually require some further review. And just a few final tips on using residual risk. These ratings help indicate how confident you are in the control environment or the effectiveness of your risk handling technique. If that residual risk rating is at the same level or higher than the inherent risk, that probably means that you don't have a lot of confidence in those controls, or your risk handling technique is not effective. And residual risk shouldn't be used to determine your risk management activities. The controls you and your vendor put in place are not going to be effective 100% of the time, so it's important to always manage the risk that occurs naturally in the engagement. For example, an inherently bad driver might be a little safer with controls like airbags and a seatbelt, but those don't improve the driver's abilities. And that brings us to our final poll question of today's session.
Our next poll question is, what do you consider the primary benefit of a residual risk rating? It confirms that mitigating controls are adequate. It brings attention to inherent risk that can't be mitigated. It helps verify our organization's risk appetite, whether or not sure. Christine, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
Okay.
If one of our vendors has recently been acquired by another company, how does that affect the risk assessment process?
So for a vendor acquisition, the first thing to do, even before you get into that risk assessment process, is to review your vendor contract just so you have a clear understanding of any termination rates you may have and may want to implement. And from there, you're going to want to treat the parent company or acquiring company as a new vendor because you probably don't have an existing relationship with them. So this means completing an inherent risk assessment on that parent company and identifying all of those risks that are found within the relationship. And as far as due diligence, that's going to depend on the type of acquisition. If your vendor was completely absorbed by the parent company, you'll want to do a new round of due diligence to evaluate their controls, which may be different from the existing vendor that you've been working with. And if the acquisition allowed the vendor to remain independent, I would still recommend a high-level due diligence review of the acquiring company, where you're doing things like an OFAC and reputation check and reviewing the ownership structure. The periodic due diligence reviews of the acquired vendor will generally stay the same though.
And here are those results. Thank you everyone for answering this question. Quickly, I would like to mention that we have our Separating Vendor Criticality from Risk Ratings infographic available for download in the related content widget. As Christine mentioned, criticality is not a risk rating. Check out this resource that explains the difference between criticality and risk rating. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Christine.
Determining the residual risk is essentially the final step in the vendor risk assessment process. But as you can see here, there are still other activities that need to take place, such as documenting the evidence and conclusions you discovered, and communicating those results to vendor owners and stakeholders. And after you complete the vendor risk assessment, you also need to schedule risk reassessments and periodic due diligence, depending on that inherent risk level. For high risk and critical vendors, these activities should be done at least annually. Moderate risk vendors can be reassessed every 18 months to 2 years, and low risk vendors every 3 years or at contract renewal. And just as an ongoing activity, it's important to stay updated on new risks and regulatory changes. You'll also want to establish a strategy for monitoring the vendor's risk and performance, which can change even after that initial vendor risk assessment. Before I wrap up with some key takeaways, I want to spend a moment on ongoing monitoring, which is such an essential activity of third-party risk management. This activity involves addressing any unresolved issues or control weaknesses that require remediation. When you're going through the risk assessment process, it's always possible that you'll find issues like missing or ineffective controls. And oftentimes these aren't remediated right away, so ongoing monitoring helps ensure that you revisit these issues and make sure they're still being addressed. Monitoring should always continue throughout the contract term, not just in the early stages of the vendor engagement. This often includes SLA tracking and performing those risk reassessments to determine if any new risks have been identified. Third-party monitoring tools can be effective to track things like vendor's reputation or cybersecurity risk. And that frequency I mentioned is shown here for periodic risk reassessment. The same frequency can also be used for due diligence, but I do want to mention that certain due diligence items like insurance certificates and SOC reports should be collected and reviewed as they expire, rather than waiting for the scheduled due diligence review. I've covered a lot of topics today, but here are some key takeaways that I think are worth mentioning. First, inherent risk types can overlap, but you should always identify them individually. Criticality is separate from inherent risk, and there are 4 risk handling techniques: avoidance, transference, mitigation, and acceptance. Mitigating controls are a shared responsibility that you and your vendor should implement, and residual risk is what remains after the inherent risk is mitigated. And those risk assessments should be performed throughout the vendor relationship on a frequency that correlates to the inherent risk rating. There's always going to be new things to learn about assessing vendor risk because third-party risk is always changing. Of course, AI risk is becoming a bigger topic, but it's still so new and changing so rapidly that I wanted to focus on some of the more common risk types for today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope that you learned some new information that you can use within your own third-party risk management program.
Great, thank you so much, Christine, for that session. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Christine for her time in sharing some important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On June 25th, the Vendor Due Diligence Process End-to-End webinar, and on July 9th, our Third-Party Risk Management Reports, Right Data, Frequency, and Content webinar. We hope you'll be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during the session. Okay, Christine, our next question is, I have a question related to the financial risk. Many times we ask for financial statements from vendors, but due to confidentiality, some don't share the financial statements. What are the alternative measures to perform the risk assessment in terms of financial risk?
Yeah, this is a common challenge for many organizations, especially when they're dealing with private vendors that aren't obligated to release those financial documents to regulatory agencies. We always recommend requesting about 2 to 3 years worth of balance sheets, income statements, and cash flow statements, but it's understandable that you might have some trouble getting those. So if you're unable to obtain financial statements from your vendors, I would recommend asking for alternatives like a financial audit or review that was performed by an independent third-party accounting company. You could also look at their tax filings, which can give you a look at the vendor's expenses, revenue, and profitability, or a financial health letter, which is something that the vendor management team will sometimes prepare. A credit report from Dun & Bradstreet or a similar organization can also give some insight into the vendor's financial health. And something else you could try is suggesting a call or webinar with your financial expert and the vendor's executives or CFO, so you can have a conversation about that vendor's financial health. I hope that helps.
Great. Our next question. Oftentimes, organizations and people tie in criticality to the inherent risk questions. Do you think these should be separate?
Yes, this is a topic that comes up pretty frequently because some organizations don't distinguish between the two. Criticality should always be determined separately from inherent risk because it's important to identify those vendors that are actually essential and have a business impact on your organization or customers. So many high-risk vendors are also critical, but not always. An example I like to use is a shredding company because this would be considered high risk since they have access to your sensitive data. However, it probably isn't considered critical because you could easily find a replacement vendor that provides the same service. So separating criticality and inherent risk, it just helps ensure that you're assessing the right controls and know which vendors are essential.
Great. Next question. What are examples of vendor services that directly interact with customers?
An outsourced call center is a common example that would interact directly with your customers. IT support is another service that some organizations outsource to third parties. So if you think about customers calling IT support or maybe chatting with them online through a chat box, that would be a direct interaction.
Okay, great. Next question here. What type of rating scale should be used to measure the effectiveness of a control? For example, either yes, no, or low, moderate, high.
When you're determining whether a control is effective, I would recommend using a tiered system that aligns with the levels of inherent risk you're using. So if you're using a risk rating scale of low, moderate, and high, it's going to be easier to use a similar rating scale to measure the control effectiveness. So maybe those three levels are described as ineffective, moderately effective, and effective. Some organizations even use 5 levels to give a little more distinction between each level, so they can rate some risks moderately low or moderately high. It just depends on how much detail you want to include in your risk ratings. But whatever scale you use should be consistent and include clear descriptions of how your organization defines each level. So if a control is measured as moderately effective, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that the control is meeting the bare minimum or there are improvements to be made? So control effectiveness can sometimes be subjective, and it's important to have those clear definitions.
Next question. Does an existing vendor need to be reassessed if we purchase a new product or service?
Yes, the risk assessment should always be done at the product or service level because not all products and services contain the same types of risk. For example, maybe your organization has been using a vendor for consulting services, and this doesn't require any integration into your systems, and the vendor doesn't have any access to sensitive data. But after a few years, maybe you decide to use that same vendor for a different service like compliance testing. And maybe that type of service does require access to sensitive data and it integrates into your system. So those two services can pose different risks, and it's important to assess them individually just to make sure that you have the appropriate controls in place and they're effective.
Great. Next question. Can you provide some tips on assessing AI risk?
Sure. Before you think about how to assess AI risk, I think it's important to understand that there are actually different subcategories you want to look at. So data privacy and security are common examples, as well as bias and fairness risk, which refers to AI systems that are trained on biased data. So even though we generally think of AI as being automated and involving machine learning, there's still a certain level of human involvement because humans are the ones that are feeding data into these systems. But going back to assessing AI risk, one of the first steps to take is to ask your vendor questions about how they're using AI in their products or services. So maybe your vendor is using AI in research and development, or maybe it's being used in the actual production of the products and services you're using. I would say it's also important to know whether your vendor is using AI to store or process any of your sensitive data. And asking these questions can help you identify the types of vendor due diligence you need to review, such as maybe policies that describe how the vendor's employees can use AI and any sort of required training that they have.
Great. Thank you, Christine. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you again, Christine, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. Another big thank you to Christine for her time and content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you will find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, including vendor risk assessments. If you would like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we will get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in the follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request a CPE credit. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.